Okay, let's make a start. Welcome everybody. Thanks for hanging around to the second last session of the conference. I'm sure it was difficult. Today we're going to talk about tooling for Spring's next generation. So who's presenting? I'm Andy Clement. I manage the tools group, so that group is responsible for not just STS, but the Grail support for Eclipse, the Groovy support for Eclipse, the Gradle support for Eclipse, those kinds of things. And presenting with me is Martin Lippert.
Yeah, hey, I'm Martin, and I work in Andy's group, and my work is focused on the Spring tooling, as well as a little bit on the Cloud Foundry tooling, and looking ahead what's coming next.
So just a standard disclaimer that we hope to deliver this stuff, but it may look a bit different when you finally see it. We could have just done slides, but that's too easy. So we thought, right, this is just going to be live demos today. And then we thought, no, that's too easy. Let's do live demos that require live internet. And then we said, no, that's too easy. Let's do live demos that require working internet and switch laptops. So take a moment to pray with us to the demo gods that everything hangs together. What are you going to see today? So you saw Spring Boot earlier in the week. We've been working on some integrations with Spring Boot to make it easier to get started so you don't have to dive into Maven. Chris Beam showed you the new Spring.io site with some of the getting started tutorials. We're going to show you how we've been integrating those so you can just pull them very easily into STS. Then Martin's going to spend a bit of time on Java config because we've done some work around that, not just for the boot case, but for the general Spring programming case. So it's in terms of features and performance. Then we'll touch a bit on the Groovy support. So this is the ability to now write Spring apps in Groovy for your domain objects or whatever, or your configurations, you can use Groovy. Then, if you were in Jürgen's talk the other day, and you saw he talked about Eclipse Java 8 support being scheduled for mid-2014, you may have been a bit shocked by that. I will show you what's working now and show you it's not as bad as you might think. There's quite a lot of good stuff already working if you want to try that out. And then we'll have a bit of fun at the end. We'll show you some of the little things we're doing to try and make your lives easier in Eclipse. And interestingly, these aren't necessarily Spring related. Any user of Eclipse has some pain points, I'm sure, and we're trying to address those frustrations. So, it's all demos. Let's get started. So, which Eclipse do I want first? Okay. So what I've got here, this is STS 340M1, which is going to be out today, later on today, promise. It's built, we just need to make it live. And it's got a few different things in that I'm going to go over now. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Spring Boot integration. Now, if you saw Dave do it in the keynote or in his own session, you'll see that the first thing he did is file new Maven project. Then he had to dive in there, typing artifact IDs and all kinds of cryptic stuff. But what we've got now is a new starter project wizard. And this does a similar job to that. So it's going to build us a basic boot app, the basic one that Dave showed you. But this is a bit of an unusual wizard in Eclipse terms. What is behind this wizard is actually a web service. So this wizard doesn't know how to build a project, how to construct a Maven project, a Spring Boot Maven project. It actually makes use of a web service to build it. And the URL section is probably going to disappear when we're finished, but just for now, I'll show you it. So the boot team created a site called Spring Initializer. So any of you are familiar with Initializer.com, it's a way to just click a few options and get down a working project. They've created an equivalent one, I think it's written in Spring Boot, for Spring Boot projects. So you can choose a style of app you want, whether you're writing web app or whatever. Choose what you want at the end and press generate, and it will give you a download that is a working Maven project of that style. So this wizard is actually built on top of that. The fields in this wizard dynamically build based on that service. So as those guys add more starters for more kinds of application, these set of styles will change over time. That means as they extend the Spring Initializer site, you don't need to download a new STS to pick up those features. It has drawbacks though. It's the first time we've really built something like this that requires an internet connection. So if you're on the plane home tonight or tomorrow, and you've got STS, you're not going to be able to build a Spring Boot project using this because you won't have an internet connection. So it's an experiment. we'd like to get feedback on that. If having an internet connection all the time is difficult for you, maybe not necessarily because you can't have one, but maybe your company firewall won't let you go through it to do this kind of thing, let us know. But the benefits are that we get this kind of dynamic update facility where if they make changes to how they generate the project or the options, the styles of projects, we just pick that up for free, and that's nice. So I'm just going to build a web one. So we've talked to that service, we said we want a web project, generated it, done a Maven import of the result, and we're back with the application just as Dave showed it the other day. And it didn't have to touch any Maven tooling there. So that's the Java case, but I think Dave showed you in the keynote the Groovy case. I just want to spend a moment talking about where we are with the Groovy boot story, because that's a little bit more complicated. So in this other Eclipse, this is a GGTS, but you could use it, it could be an STS with Groovy Eclipse installed. I've got the latest Groovy Eclipse installed here. I'm just going to show you some of the mechanisms that make Groovy boot work, maybe demystify some of the magic there. And you'll see that we've got the underpinnings of it, but we haven't done that next layer of UI on top. So the reason that Groovy boot works the way it does, the reason you can write so little code and it works, is because of a couple of facilities in Groovy. So I think Dave talked a little bit about grab. Grab is a way that you can inline in your code your dependencies. So you don't have to write a POM that says, I depend on this, I depend on that. You can express it in your source code. So here, it's very much like declaring a Maven dependency. I'm depending on Yoda time. And we've done a lot of work lately in Groovy Eclipse to make sure it gives you nice feedback. So here I'm grabbing a version that doesn't exist. So I get a nice message. If you do that with another Groovy Eclipse, then chaos will ensue. So we fixed all that up. So grab is working nicely. And what grab actually does is when the Groovy compiler starts compiling this file, Yoda, it comes across that grab annotation, fetches a jar from the internet, sticks it onto a class loader attached to this compiler, and then when this compiler needs to resolve types, like date time, it actually sees them through this class loader. So that dependency never actually makes it onto this project, which is a bit weird in Eclipse terms, because you're used to seeing all your dependencies in the Package Explorer. And you even get facilities like Content Assist. That works even though the dependency doesn't really exist on the project through the magic of grab. But interestingly, what you've got here, when you compile this class, it won't run. It won't run as a regular Java app because of the grab. Because grabs, when you run it, no one's adding that Yoda time class if you just run it as a regular Java app. So if I attempt to run this, it's a Java app. It fails because grab can't do its work. It can't stick that jar on the class loader it needs, so the dependency can't be resolved. Which is why these things, if you're using grab, have to be run as a Groovy script, which then gives the file to Groovy and says you need to run this. Groovy will set up the class loader hierarchy and grab can do its work. So you can see it works just fine. So grab is a piece of the puzzle that makes Groovy boot work, but there's no grabs in this file. And there's also no imports. These types aren't imported, and yet they appear to be resolved. If they couldn't be resolved in Groovy, they'd be underlined. So why does that work? So the other piece of the puzzle is that we're using something in Groovy called a compiler customizer. And I think from the name you can work out what that does. So we have a customizer plugged into a project at the moment using project preferences. So my preferences for this project say, I'm plugging in a customizer, and this is the guy. And then let's go and look at that customizer. So this customizer will be used when building app.groovy. And this is taken from the Spring Boot internal, slightly massaged to work more easily in this environment. It's very simple, really. The customizer says, when do you want to run in the compilation process? When do you want to customize? This guy says, I want to run early on because I'm going to add dependencies that you'll need later on. And then the customizer gets called every time something gets compiled. And it just does two simple things. It adds some imports automatically, adds some dependencies automatically. So here you can see imports for controller are just added for us as this customizer is called. And similarly down here, this is just another way of expressing grab. The dependencies are put together and then passed to grab. So it's all happening behind the scenes in a customizer when you have a Groovy boot app. And this has the similar kind of problem. When this compiles by itself, you can't run it as a no, I'm not going to do that because I haven't done that. I've practiced that demo. It doesn't run as a Java app for the same reason. It has to be run, and I think Dave showed you, the way you run Groovy boot apps is you give them to something called the Spring CLI, which does a similar kind of job. It sets up the environment in which these things can run. So when we run that, what we need to use, I've defined a launch configuration here for Groovy boot. We're running the Spring CLI module from Spring Boot, which is what that Spring command line script does, Dave showed. And we're telling it to run app.groovy, and we're passing ---- watch. I'll show you what that does in a minute. But when I run that, it sets up the environment for app.groovy, for this file, Groovy boot, runs it, and that's now up and going. And I pass the ---- watch option, and that actually creates the file system watcher. So as it sees this script change, you'll see the file watchers went, oh, that's changed, I'll do an automatic redeploy for you. So now the app is updated. I don't have to keep remembering to stop it and start it, it's doing it all for me. That watch option is only currently available for the Groovy flavor of boot apps. So that's all. You can see we've got the machinery there to build Groovy boot, but it's not fun at the moment. You have to set these customizers and worry about that kind of stuff. What we're going to build on top of this is a layer that says, oh, recognize a boot app and say, oh, you need this customizer from boot. I'm going to do that automatically for you. So it would all be seamless when we're finished. But the underlying bits and pieces are there and ready to be used. Well, most of them. One problem we have at the moment is the customizers in boot are much smarter than the one I showed there. What they actually do is more dynamically compute the imports based on the jars on the class path. So it will say, oh, you've got the security jar. I will automatically add the imports for the Spring security classes. And those are very deeply nested in Spring Boot, and we need to tease them up to the surface so that we can use them in Groovy Eclipse. But anyway, that was Groovy Boot. Small tangent there. Back, yeah.
In this, like you started the project, you created that form.xml and Java side.
Yeah.
Is there a way to create a grader?
Not at the moment through the initializer thing, but I'm sure that will come because they will support both variants. Yeah. So I've got my app, but it doesn't do anything. It will run, but it's got nothing in it. And I said it was a web app. I think to make it sexy, I have to do something RESTful in it. That's what we do these days. But I'm not quite sure of the syntax for this stuff. So I'm pretty sure there's a getting started guide for doing RESTful stuff. So let's have a look at how those are integrated. And I'll use one of those to extend this app. So this is a new dashboard at the moment. We're still tweaking it, but the idea is it gives you quick access to things you might want on a regular basis. So you've got things like the forums, the bug tracker, the Spring Framework docs, and we've got a way to browse the getting started guides that Chris mentioned. So you can search through them if you want to do something with Facebook, say. I want to do something with REST. That's building a RESTful web service. Down the line, we want to kind of have a button on this page that says import into STS, but we're not quite there yet. So we have, at the moment, an import guide button on here. This launches another wizard. This is the new Getting Started wizard, which has a similar kind of filter facility so you can find the guide you're interested in. I want REST. And interestingly, this is another one of those dynamic wizards, like the first one I mentioned. This one doesn't have a hard-coded list of guides in it. It talks to GitHub when you open it and says, what is the latest set? So as they commit guides, they don't have to do anything extra work. This wizard will recognize them and you can import them. What choices do you get? You can choose if you want Maven or Gradle for these things, and you can choose the code sets. What are the code sets? Well, each guide comes with an initial state, so before it's been properly started, and a complete state, which is what project you should end up with if you follow the guide material. And then at the bottom we have the home page for the guide. So if you import both those code sets, you would start working on initial, follow the instructions on that home page. You should end up with complete, and when you get to the end, you can compare what you've done with the complete version and see if you managed to do it right. So let's import that. So that's going to GitHub, getting the real project, doing the import, either a Gradle or a Maven import, and pulling it into Eclipse. And you'll see it's opened up the guide. And we've been working quite closely with the Spring.io guys so that this tab in the browser is actually an unusual size. It's a bit cramped, and they've done some work making the Spring.io website adaptive enough so that it shrinks down and looks good in this size. But I don't need to look through that. I'm just going to steal code. So I'm pretty sure it's going to have what I need in the complete version of this app. So yeah, there's a domain class. There's a controller. So I'm just going to steal that into my app. So I just drag the pieces I need into my application. And through the magic of Spring Boot, I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to go off and define anything. I mean, it's got all the right annotations in place, and auto configuration's been set. So I can just run this now. And we have a new shortcut for run a Spring Boot app. Which will launch that. I think it's on /greeting. Yeah, that's returning us some JSON, hello world. So there's a typical interaction, I think, with the Getting Started guide. So I had my app. I thought, I know the kind of thing I want to do, but I don't know the exact syntax. Quickly search the guides, import it, grab some code. I can move on, copying this pattern as I flesh it out with more REST controllers.
Question.
Yep.
What does the run Spring Boot app do besides just running the main greeting?
That's a good question. We're finding there are some deficiencies in the normal launch app option because even if you have just a one class in your project with a main method, it goes hunting through your dependencies looking for main methods. I don't know why it does that. That doesn't seem very sensible because obviously you want to run the one in your project. So we're trying to work out around those deficiencies because it's not a place that we can tweak Eclipse. So it's just a convenience function. But I mean, it does generalize to more than just boot. It could be any Java app could benefit from that. Now, normally what you do here is you would say, OK, I want to add security to this app. And if you watch Dave's presentation, what he then did was dive into the Maven POM and start adding new dependencies, then come back to the code and start writing the code. But what we want to do is we want to build something new for Content Assist where you tell Content Assist, these are some jars I might want to use in an app. And Content Assist will analyze those jars, look at the types, and then in the future, all I need to do is when I press Content Assist here, maybe on a different page of it, it will suggest me things that I might want in my app. And if I select one of them, we will auto update the POM or the Gradle file to bring in the dependency, so you don't have to do it yourself. So if I wanted security here, I could just use the right security annotation, and as soon as I select it, it'll dynamically update the dependencies, and I won't have to do it myself. So we're going to start work on that very soon. And I think that generalizes to more than just boot apps. That's a generally applicable solution to an annoying problem. So I'll just add one more facility to this and show you what that pane's like at the moment. So I'm going to add a dependency to the actuator. If you don't know what that is, that's a starter you can plug in that gives your app some extra facilities, some extra endpoints that might be generally applicable for any app. And you don't have to write this infrastructure. So then I have to do, well, I may not have to do, but I might as well press Maven Update Project. Never quite know whether that's necessary. The good old Maven tools. And you'll see next to the launch button, we've actually started adding this stop button and relaunch button. And this was because some people in blogs online and us ourselves have started complaining that why is the launch button up here but the stop button down here? And you'll find if you're running multiple things in the console, you first have to find the right console before you can press the right stop button. Or you just give up, go to the debug perspective and press stop. That's very annoying. So we've put some options up here so you can more easily stop things or relaunch things. And if you just press it, it'll just shut down the thing that's whatever's running and then relaunch it again in one step. So I just relaunched that and I added the actuator dependency. And so the app should still be working fine, but I get a new endpoint.
So,
Yeah.
maybe it's not necessarily directly about STS, but at this point, the Tomcat that you're running, if I understood that prior talk, is embedded within the application.
Yes, it is.
So typically you go to the Windows preferences and you set up your Tomcat and you deploy your warrant to it. Like, so how would you...
There's config options for boot to select what you want to run inside, the version of Tomcat or whether you want Jetty. That's not surfaced through STS at the moment. So you can still deploy it to the integrated Tomcat if you want to, but you kind of have to package it up as an application and then deploy it that way.
Okay, so you don't even need a server tab.
You don't, not with boot. It's just all internal. So I've just visited the metrics endpoint, and that shows you that we've been visiting greeting. We've been there once since the app came up. And there's other endpoints the actuator creates. You can go and check out the docs for that. So that's how to get started with Spring Boot, how to make use of the Getting Started guides. And I talked a bit about where we're going with this and what you can expect to see in the next few milestones in the release. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Martin, who's going to take this app a bit further. Cross your fingers for the first laptop switch.
Ooh. Okay, let's try. What I need first, power, and then maybe the projector. That would be good. Let's see. So when the projector comes up, what I would like to show you is first I try to start exactly where Andy ended. So this is the demo project being created from Spring Boot, enhanced with a controller. What you might haven't seen yet is that the Spring Boot stuff does only depend, it's only using Java config. And more people are starting using Java config and using annotations all the time, and are not using any kind of Spring XML configuration anymore. And if you're familiar with the Spring IDE and the Spring tool suite, you might know that there is a lot of tooling for making life with XML easier for you, right? You have tons of content assist, tons of quick fixes, validations for Spring XML files to help you not forgetting about defined beans and things like that. Tons of tooling. But we see that more and more people are using Java config now. So our goal is to make the tooling for Java config in STS up to the same level as the tooling that we have for XML. So giving you all the validations, giving you the outlooks, giving you the overviews, and giving you content assist and stuff like that for Java config. So making your life with Java config easier, even though maybe most of the people think Java config is already a lot easier than XML. So that's good. So we try to make it even easier. In this case, when the Spring Boot stuff, Spring Boot project gets created, and there's a controller in, there's no XML, but we can still show you in the Spring elements, the Spring Explorer in this case, or it's embedded in the Project Explorer, what's inside this application from a Springy point of view, showing you, oh, there's a request mapping, there's a controller, I can jump there. And this is possible because we are now able to configure the Java config classes, like the add configuration annotated classes, as Spring configs as well in Spring IDE, and I will show you in a minute how that works. But this is not all. We try to give you all the nice editing features as well for Java config. So what we are trying to do, and we did, let's say the first steps, is, for example, to make it easy here, in this case, to add a new request mapping method with some code templates. I can just type get for a get method, and now I get some kind of code template for a get method here. Maybe it's not exactly what I would like to do now, so I could, of course, jump here and customize that myself. That would be nice. But I would like to do something else. Let me quickly copy over this method and customize it a little bit. Say, I would like to see a personalized message here. Listening to personalize to this URL. And instead of using request parameters, I would like to use path variables. So I type in here, it's a path variable. String, let's say it's first, and it's I have a path variable for string last name, and then I give back an answer saying first was last. So this is okay, this is nice, but of course I need to tweak the URL that this request mapping method is being mapped to a little bit. And this is one of the places where we try to increase the experience in STS by giving you content assist. So when I now try to put the ID, the path variable, into the URL, we give you directly in the string, which is basically just a string in the IDE, give you content assist for, because we know, hey, this is the place where you insert path variables, right? So we know, oh, there's a path variable being defined, it's first, and there is a path variable maybe being defined last, giving you a content assist for this. Right? So you don't have to type everything yourself, you don't do mistakes, you don't mistype, whatever. Just gives you exactly the thing. So, and good content assist for this kind of annotation. And we are trying to do more of this, right? So this is, at the moment, works for request mapping annotations, for these path variables, and we are trying to do more and more and more content assist for all those different kinds of annotations, whatever is useful. So in many of those cases, the pure content assist from Eclipse is already working, so giving you meaningful stuff, which is good. Some cases it's more specific, and because we know this is Spring, and this is the Spring request mapping annotation, we know a little bit more about this, so we can provide better tooling. I think that there was a question?
Does it go the other way? Like, we usually know our request mapping, that sort of drives everything, so does it go the other way? So, for instance, I did first, last on the request mapping.
I am not...
Variable, will it give me my first and last for the variable name?
I think we, not at the moment, but I think we try to, I think there was at least a prototype that we implemented for, if you put a path variable in there and define which path variable it is to give you the same content assist being parsed from the annotation, so the other way around. Definitely makes sense. And by the way, if you have more suggestions from this kind, please let us know. We are very happy to hear from you saying, oh yeah, this content is nice, but it's useless because I do it the other way around. I do it this way, I do it this way, I need content assist here, content assist there. Let us know. We are very, very happy to hear about all those suggestions, all those ideas. Because it's a huge bunch of annotations, right? And it's sometimes a bit hard to just where to start and what exactly to do first, and what people are actually really using. So, another question. Yeah, we implemented that. We did validation for that. We disabled it at the moment because we figured out that the validation was a little bit too stupid. So it just mapped, worked in certain cases, and it indicated errors where it wasn't an error because the request mapping string was more complicated. So the validation was not smart enough to parse exactly what was meant there because it could be fairly dynamic. So that made it a little bit difficult, but we tried that and it was enabled in a previous version, so we disabled it at the moment. But the idea is, of course, to bring that back once we figured out how to make these validation a bit more smarter, so that you don't end up seeing 5 million warnings about your request mappings, but they're actually correct. Right? That would be bad. But of course, any validation would be disabled. You can disable them, so that's always possible. Okay, so of course I can quickly restart, restart the application to let you know that this actually works. That's the greeting. That's the personalize. Oops. Hello, Andy.
Thank you.
Good. So I said that we are supporting this Java config style now, and what you might know is that in the XML world of Spring, in Spring IDE, you was able to define which XML files the IDE should use to parse and to use to build up the model, build up content assist, which was basically done in the preferences of the project in this dialog, right? You can just add XML, and then you choose the XML files of your project being used by the IDE. And now you have the option to also define your Java config classes in this dialog in exactly the same way, right? So you can just scan, it scans for those types, you can add config, gives you all the classes that are annotated with add configuration or add import or things like that. And the nice piece that we added is, for example, for the Spring Boot case, there's an auto-configuration mechanism for that. So if you import a Spring Boot project or any project that has the add enable auto-configuration annotation on it, this type will automatically be configured. So you don't have to dive into this preference page yourself, manually, doing all the stuff manually. So this actually, this works so nicely that even if I remove this here and say, okay, it's being automatically reconfigured for your project. It's there again. So if you want to remove that, please just, of course, disable that. Then you can remove it again. And you see if I press scan, it shows up again. I can configure it again. So the usual stuff. The other option is that there's also an auto configuration for all the add configuration classes and add import classes. And that is a little bit more, let's say, more dangerous, because in projects there are often you have multiple classes that are annotated with that add configuration thing. Maybe you have test classes as well. And this automatic detection, we're trying to make it as smart as possible to just detect the right things. But we're not there yet, so therefore we disabled it by default, but you can try it, you can enable it, and then it will automatically configure all the add configuration classes of your project as well, and you don't need to do that manually. At the moment it's disabled because we think it's not yet smart enough to do exactly the right thing all over the place, and then it could get quickly annoying a little bit. It just configured too much stuff for you. But we're trying, so please try it out, let us know. What are the cases that maybe are not really working, or where it's picking up too much stuff for you, or too less? Let us know. That would be great. Okay. Interestingly, this Java config support does not only work for Java. You might remember from the keynotes from the first day that, and from talks from Jürgen about Spring 4, there's some kind of, oh, we support Groovy as well, and oh, okay, Spring 4 supports more Groovy style programming. We do Groovy Eclipse, and we do the Groovy tooling for Eclipse. Would be the natural idea to combine those two things and enable that to be used together, right? Using Spring IDE together with the Groovy tooling in Eclipse, and that's actually possible now to some degree. So I convert this project to a Groovy project, so I add the Groovy perspective to that, so that it's enabled for Groovy, and let me add a Groovy class to that. That's my Groovy config. And I make this, it's not yet supporting the Groovy bean builder thing, the stuff that the Groovy people love about doing Groovy style Spring development, but it lets you program your configuration files in Groovy. So what I can do here is, let me implement a Spring configuration class in Groovy. There's maybe a bean method, just bean. Let's just do an object, get my super bean, and I have to import that. So that looks good. Looks like a nice Groovy class. So I'm not the biggest Groovy fanboy and the biggest Groovy expert. So this is my poor Groovy class. That's to the level I can write Groovy. Any knows more about that, actually? A lot more, a lot more. But what I can do now is I can also configure this. If I scan that, it shows up as a valid Spring configuration as well in my project. So I can configure it exactly in the same way. So I configure my Java-based Java configs for Spring in Spring IDE and use that. And it shows up here in my, oh, it shows up twice. That's great. Oh, because I put it in the same package, so it's being scanned twice now. But 2 times is better than no times. So that's good. Yeah, that's actually interesting because it's now being scanned twice because it's in the same package, and there's a component scan annotation here. So this component scan annotation, of course, scans everything that's in this package, and of course also scans the Groovy case. And I also configured it as a Spring config. So usually I would not put that into the same package, I put that in separate packages and not just plainly component scan that. And then it would make more sense to have that as separate configurations for the project. If it's being scanned automatically, I don't need to set that up as a separate Groovy config for this project. Okay, that's good for my demo Spring Boot project. And I would like to show you in the next step how, let's say, not just a tiny little Spring Boot project would look like, but you can actually use all this tooling for a usual Spring Java config using application and project in your IDE. So it's not specific for Spring Boot, of course. It is support for Java config in general. And this is the RESTbugs project. Maybe some of you went to the talk by Oliver Gierke about the RESTbugs and REST URLs and JP and Spring Data stuff in the background, things like that, where he used the RESTbugs project. And as you can see, the RESTbugs project contains a lot more stuff, right? And we show you a nice overview about what's inside your Spring application for the Java config case now as well. Like showing you the request mappings, showing you the Spring Data repositories that you have defined, the aspects, all the stuff that you might already have seen for the XML case, right? For configuring Spring with XML, those stereotypes would show up here in the Spring Explorer or Project Explorer as well, but now all that stuff works for the pure Java config case as well. Really nice. So including these tiny little annotations saying you, oh yeah, there's an aspect. This aspect is in this case advising a payment service class, payment service impl in this case, a pay method, all those nice little helpers and additional information, because we know what Spring is. The IDE understands your application from the Spring perspective and can let you know what's inside. What we think is still a little bit missing in this section is that new annotations that are being used in Spring are, or many of those annotations are now being processed automatically with these @enable XYZ thing. Like there's an @enable auto configuration or @enable repositories or whatever. And there's a lot of magic going on behind the scenes, what this annotation is actually doing. So you don't really, just from using it, you just don't really know what's going on. So the plan is to show up those annotations, to let them show up here in this Spring Explorer as well, and to let the Spring Explorer tell you what is being created because of this annotation, right? So you can have a @enable auto configuration annotation here, a note for this. If you expand that, you see what's being created because you put in this @enable auto configuration annotation. What's being created there. And the same for all the others. That's what we think might also be useful to help you a little bit to understand what's going on behind the scenes in your IDE for your application when you're using these @enable and then, @enable magic, right? Oh, nobody really knows what's going on there. That's a plan. It's not yet implemented, but that's an idea. If you have additional ideas, always welcome, right? We are very, very open to suggestions, ideas. Let us know what you think would be useful. An interesting part of this support is that you might be familiar with that already, is that you can have config sets. So you can combine Spring configurations into a set to let this set being used for validation, right? So you have your configuration. Usually you don't have one big XML file or one big Java config file for your application. You have that hopefully nicely modularized into separate things, and one for the general stuff, one thing for production, one thing for testing, and so on. So it's spread out across different things. And the validations that we have inside Spring IDE, they don't really know by default what is being available all over the place. But you can define those things as a config set. So you can say, okay, my config set in this case for the REST box, the config set belongs or consists out of the application config, Java config class, which is some kind of the general stuff that I use all over the place in my tests, in my application, and the web configuration, which is an additional configuration that adds the additional stuff for providing a nice REST API for my application. And you can put both things together so that the validations know what is there. To show you what the result is let me just quickly disable one of them. So this config set just contains out of just one of those annotations. And what you see here is that in the problems, there's a tiny little problem showing up and telling you that, hey, you have these annotated class here, this being auto-wired, but in this configuration set that I'm using here, there is no bean being defined that would get injected at runtime into this auto-wired parameter, which I think is very helpful. So you know, especially in these kind of doing auto-wired things, and you do not really see and immediately know where those injections come from. You don't know, oh, did I maybe forgot to define that bean? The IDE tells you exactly that. It's kind of the same validation that we have for XML files. We're saying, oh yeah, put in a bean reference to another bean, and the other bean definition is actually missing. And the same stuff works here for the auto-wired annotation. Yes?
What would be helpful is, like, you know, on the auto-wired annotation, there is like Control T and you can see what object is really getting auto-wired?
Yeah, thank you for this suggestion. That's what's being implemented now. So in addition to this validation, let me quickly fix this problem. So I put this back so everything is being validated correctly. Again, the error goes away because now in the other configuration there's this bean being defined. And what I can do now is navigation, what you suggested. So in Eclipse, you have hyperlink navigation. You can just press Command, and you can, for example, navigate to this type. What you can do now for auto-wired method parameters and fields is if you go over here, you see open declaration, open type, and open auto-wired bean. So now you can here jump to the auto-wired bean, and you jump to, oh, the payment service impl bean, the stuff that's being declared in this class, that's being injected into this auto-wired parameter of field. That's brand new stuff.
All the config you have done for the compiler. How about runtime? How does that figure it out?
The runtime, oh, that's usually something we don't care because that's doing this. That's done by the Spring framework. The Spring framework. You mean at runtime how Spring framework is doing the auto wiring and injection?
The project in avoiding just have the config set. You remove the web MVC config. Other give you warnings.
Oh,
Runtime still works, right?
yeah. Sorry. So there's at runtime you usually in this case at runtime, and there is a web initializer, a servlet initializer thing, a context listener initializer, I think. I don't know exactly what it's called, where you define what application context or what configuration classes are being used for your application. And this class mentioned exactly the application config and the web configuration. So when you start up the web application, I can quickly show you that. It's in the web configuration. That's the dispatcher servlet initializer, where you define, oh, the root config is the application config thing, and the servlet configuration is the web configuration. If you start up this web application, both of those configuration classes are being given to the Spring framework, and Spring framework starts up, scans your class path, creating those beans, has nothing to do with the IDE, really. And if you would like to know exactly what's going on under the hood of the Spring framework doing all that, I would recommend to ask Jürgen Höller. He knows everything about that, or just the plain Spring sessions. Those are the best for that. Hope that answers the question.
It's a little bit confusing because people make it a habit of ignoring these warnings, and in reality, in runtime, it still works. So
Yeah.
Yeah. Get more warnings.
Yeah, first thing, of course, you can always disable the warnings if you want, which does not make sense in all the cases, because then we don't need to spend time implementing them. It'll be kind of, on the other hand, there is still a difference between the runtime and the compile time, or things that we have in the IDE. We try to use as much as possible from the real Spring framework to parse your configuration files, to not re-implement the wheel or reinvent the wheel all the time. So we do not re-implement all the functionality. We try to use exactly the same scanning functionality, the same validation functionality that's being used inside the Spring framework, using that inside the IDE as well, to have a good match. But of course, there are bits and pieces where this is not working, because at runtime there is more stuff happening dynamically that we cannot do really inside the IDE, except from firing up your application and then look inside, which is maybe not what you want to do in the IDE all the time. Another question? Oh yeah, first there and then here.
When you do the scan button, do you actually just look at the web application initializer and then pull the configs off of what's listed here, or do you do a scan of the entire class path?
We do a scan of the entire class path. The idea would be to scan those web initializer classes as well, to be more intelligent about that, and to pull out exactly those cases, which is implemented for the XML case, because there's an auto configuration for the XML case that looks inside the web XML file and see what's being configured there. We try to do the same for the Java config case. But the Java config case is always a little bit more complicated, because in those methods, you can implement anything, right? You can type in code, and it's sometimes a bit hard to guess what you might have meant with implementing this piece of code. But for the standard default cases, we will try to be smart in figuring that out automatically. Yeah, that will be another auto config mechanism. Sorry? Another question.
I saw CodeMark in one of the demos. Can you add that to the IDE? CodeMark for looking to see if you're trying to do Groovy classes and you're doing Java-like syntax.
It's like just style for Java, right?
Yeah, right.
Oh.
It's for Groovy.
That's for Groovy question. That's for Andy.
I think you can install that. Yeah, I think that's the
part
for
of
that.
the IDE.
Not, we don't provide an easy way to install that, but I'm sure if you have the update site, it should drop straight in.
It's a plugin.
I think they package that as a plugin. I'd have to dig. But there are a lot of plugins around the fringes of Groovy, and we don't include everything on the extensions update site in STS. But they should just install, because it's just plain Eclipse. It's nothing special.
Before we move on to one of my other favorite topics, one additional tiny little thing that we implemented, because we are trying to be smart about content assist and helping you with content assist inside annotations. Especially if you use component scan, there's now content assist for the packages and for the types. So if you implement that, and some nice tiny little helper to give you content assist. And we try to do more of that. Sometimes it's a bit difficult because you can't type in anything. But in some of the cases, we can do a pretty good job about that. Okay. That's about Java config support in the Spring IDE. It's kind of in the early stages. We try to lift it up to the same level as XML. We might not be there for all the cases, but I think for most of the cases, if you're using that, if you're seeing if you're observing any trouble, if you're seeing anything that's missing, let us know. We are very, very happy about that feedback.
Do you guys think about how you can, like when you use Spring integration? I can see it's more towards Spring IO, but for Spring integration, you can visualize your Spring flow, your event flow, your message flow,
That's
Only
that.
if you have an XML, only if you define the channels and everything in the XML. But if you use annotation, I don't know that you can do that.
So you mean the graphical editors that we have for Spring integrations at STS to make them work with annotation-based Spring integration applications?
This is one place
Yeah.
where we use XML because we wanted to have
Okay. That's a very good idea. We are thinking about re-implementing and renewing those graphical editors anyway. So that's a very good point. Very good point.
That would be good, because that graphical editor's not very.
That's on our to-do list for one of the next steps. Yeah. And we will talk a little bit about that. We will not show anything, I guess, but we'll talk a little bit about the general strategy behind those things at the end. So it's but thanks for the feedback. What we are also working on all the time, but we invested a lot of time recently into that, is performance, because in the old days, performance sometimes sucks. And people don't like Eclipse in general, and don't like the Spring tooling. If you do rebuild and switching to other branches, it's kind of, oh yeah, you see these building project for 5 million years, and you say, I disable auto build or whatever to keep working. So we tried to invest we invested a lot of time into improving that performance and memory consumption inside STS. And what I would like to show you is the results comparing. This is now also one of the more dangerous parts of the presentation, but interesting. So this is an older STS version. It's 2.9.2. So it's roughly about 1 year old, 1.5 years old maybe. I think last year we published 3.0, if I'm correct. So it's a little bit more than a year old. And I have a fairly big workspace. So I would like to show you some really heavy stuff, big Spring projects, a lot of stuff going on. And if you do a build of those 4 projects, that takes some time. So let's kick off. Let's bore you a little bit with this. Let's kick off a build of those 4 projects. So it's going on. What I have here as well is the latest version, and I kick off a build of the same projects in this latest version as well. So you can compare this now between the old version running down below 2.9.2 and the new version, the latest M1. But I think most of the performance improvements are already in 3.3.0. Actually, what I enabled for these projects is please do everything that is possible. Do all the validations that are inside STS, and the new version. It's done. Oh wow, sorry. It's already, the new version is already done. So while I keep talking, let's kick off another build, a second one. It's even doing more because we implemented additional validations for Spring repositories, for example, and things like that. So it's even doing more. Right? The new version doing a lot more stuff, and as you see, it's a lot faster. And if you're using small projects, working on classes, pressing save, renewing the Spring model, and stuff like that, all the builds a lot faster. So you can see it's roughly 2 times as fast as the old versions for big things, right? And it's doing more stuff. So this is amazing, and the demo worked, so awesome. That's great. One of my.
What version do you think then?
Sorry?
What version do you think has the upgrades? I know that's 2.9 you said, but you said it was like probably still already the upgrades were already in 3.1.
3.3.0. I think the biggest parts were implemented between 3.2.0 and 3.3.0. But we are continuously trying to improve that and also reduce memory consumption. So you can see here it's a little bit better. So it's in total, or the max heap size went down from 700 to maybe 560, which is also good. And we try to reduce it more, and we try to reduce garbage collection doing those builds. Oh, and those projects were even doing aspect weaving with AspectJ. So even that's being done in those really heavyweight builds. So it's a lot faster. Hope you enjoy it. And let us know if you observe any special situations where the performance still sucks. We are very happy to prove that and show you next year at the conference. Say, hey, these cases are at least twice as fast, if not 10 times as fast. There are parts of the build that are actually 10 times as fast as before. Okay, I would like to hand over to Andy again to show some even more exciting Java 8 stuff.
Thank you. Another laptop switch. Someone just asked about CodeMark, so I just had a quick look online, and yes, there is an update site for it, so you can just take that and drop it into Eclipse. So, I mean, if enough people find something useful, we're quite happy to put it on our extensions dashboard, so it's just a one-click install. It's just we don't know everything that's useful, and obviously we don't want to include everything on the internet on there. So if there's specific things you think we should be including, let us know. So, Java 8. Yes, as I said, if you went to Jürgen's talk, he said that Java 8 and Eclipse will be shipped in the Lunar release in mid-2014. That's a long way off. And some of you may wonder if they've even started yet. It's so far away. Well, yes, they have started. Just like the Spring guys had already started working to the original JDK date, the Eclipse guys have also started working. So we are a long way along. A lot of compiler stuff is going to work, and I'm going to show you some of that now. In Eclipse. So what I have here is an STS, but I've used a special update site to add Java 8 support. Many of the Eclipse components, like the JDT core, JDT UI, have beta Java 8 branches that are in the repositories. They're a little difficult to configure and get together if you want to try it out. So what we've started doing, and you'll see the update site in the new and noteworthy for this release, there's an update site for Java 8. So all you do is take your STS, Eclipse 4.3, well, it doesn't have to be an STS, any Eclipse 4.3, point it at the update site, install it, and you get a feature patch to the compiler that will add Java 8 capabilities. Now, it's important, it's a feature patch. That means it patches the compiler. Groovy Eclipse is also a feature patch that patches the compiler. You can't install them both at the same time. So at the moment, if you're going to play around with Java 8, you can't also be playing around with Groovy. You have to make a choice. Now, down the line, there will be one super patch, when I find time to do it, that adds Java 8 and Groovy support at the same time. So, Java 8, what are we going to do? So, in this, I mean, some of you may be Java 8 experts and seen all this before, but hopefully a few of you, you'll learn a few new things that you didn't know were in Java 8. But really the takeaway here is, look how much already works, and if you want to try it out, it's there. There are a few gaps, and I'll point those out as we go along. So let's just create a demo project. Let's take a quick look at it. If you look at the Java compiler level, you see we are 1.8 beta. The Eclipse guys seem very nervous, so everything's got the word beta everywhere, so you don't think that it's ready for production yet. Now, when you take an Eclipse and install a compiler like this, you have to be careful what JRE you're using. There are various levels of OpenJDK Beta 8 available. They're on beta 106 at the moment, I think. And if you think about it, when you download one of those betas, you get a compiler and a runtime that are perfectly compatible. But here, you've got a different compiler. You have to make sure you download a runtime that's compatible with that compiler. The Eclipse guys haven't got time for every beta release to chase it and update for it. So they kind of pick one, rebase themselves on that, and then a few releases later, they'll pick another JDK and jump to that. So at the moment, I'm using beta 97 of OpenJDK here with this Java 8 support. There are some problems if you try and use beta 106, some Lambda-related problems. But I'm assured that by the end of next week, those will be fixed. So if you install this Java 8 support, install beta 106, that's a compatible pair. If you have any problems getting a pair that work together, just post on our forums, email me, get hold of me. I'll help you get a pair that work together. So this is a Java 8 project, so we can do Java 8 stuff. So there's no magic different sequence here for working with these Java 8 features. You just do the stuff you're used to doing. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to go through a few features just to show you how they work in the UI. So create an interface, create an implementation, create a main method, all standard stuff. Something you may be familiar with doing in Java pre 1.8 is you have an interface and then you have a class with static methods on for manipulating instances of that interface. That's a common pattern to follow. But now you can put static methods in your interface. So that's fine, that's Java 8. If you try that in Java 7, it won't let you do it. Equals, get import. That's all fine, Java 8 working fine. But also, you can now put method implementations in here. They have lots of different names. I'm calling them default methods, but people call them defender methods. They're called all kinds of things. I'm going to call it print. So that means that implementation still compiles here. That's because it doesn't need to implement the print method because somebody already has. It can choose to implement it if it wants to, but it doesn't have to. And if it doesn't, that means when someone calls print, they'll be running the default method. This is quite a powerful facility. It means over time you can evolve interfaces. And as long as you include default implementations, you don't have to then update all your implementations of that interface. It's a very powerful facility. So you can see, all works perfectly well in Eclipse if you want to start using that feature. And we'll come back to those a little later on when we do some AspectJ stuff. Oh, we'll show you one extra thing. No one asked me, but it's a good question. What happens if there are two guys who provide default methods? Have we got multiple inheritance here in Java now? What if impl implements both of those? Which one do I get? You get an error saying, no, no, you can't be that smart. It's an error, you can't do it. And if anyone familiar with AspectJ, these look very like ITDs on an interface. And in fact, they do exactly the same thing. The implementation, if you did an ITD on an interface with AspectJ, you were supplying a default implementation. But that used to be implemented by us hunting down all the classes that implement the interface and sticking the code in them. But we can greatly simplify AspectJ when these are supported by just sticking the code in the interface. So let me...
Is there a way to inject something like interface that you set up new input? No, I don't know how that you have to have the interface being managed.
I'm sure you could do something clever there. I was just doing something very simple.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, that works fine. Let's try something more exciting. Let's try lambdas. Everybody loves lambdas. So what can we do with lambdas? So I am going to add a... Lambdas work around something called functional interfaces, which isn't scary. It's just an interface with a method like that, a standard one single method. That's a functional interface. And they even provide you with an annotation, so you can say, I am a functional interface. And that actually gets policed. So if you try and add another method, you get the error saying, you said you're a functional interface, but you're not. So you can enforce that. You can add default methods here if you want to. That's fine. The point is you just have to have one abstract method to be considered a functional interface. And then we all know in the old days what you do is new printer, then you press control space and it throws up all over your screen, and then you fill it in. So we've got an anonymous inner class here, and it looks terrible. It's so ugly. Look, yeah, look. It looks really so ugly, it's confusing me. And then we can use that. Okay, so that's anonymous in a class. And one way to think about lambdas is actually just an anonymous method. So that code will run, but I can create another printer that is a lambda. Now you'll see, what I was about to type is that, and then press that, but it doesn't work. This is a case where the Eclipse Java support isn't quite there yet. So the compiler is in really good shape, but the stuff on top of it, the refactoring tools, the content assist, is not there yet. And the reason for that is the compiler is still changing underneath. The AST is not fixed yet, so they don't want to go up a level and start building everything that depends on a particular AST if they're going to have to change it. So you have to do some typing. So that's me using a lambda. Kind of an anonymous method. And the idea is that lambda can satisfy the functional interface printer. This is something you haven't typically seen in Java before, this kind of magic inferencing of types. This is in the spec called something like a poly expression. Yep.
Where do you get the name print for the lambda method? Should it be like p2.call or something?
The types that are involved in here and the method are based on this functional interface that it's being assigned to. So because printer defines a print method, the lambda is satisfying the printer interface. And you can use a lambda anywhere this information can be inferred. So here, because of the assignment, we can say, oh, he means this is an implementation of printer. We could use it, say, in the return value of a method, because in the return value, you look at the method signature, you say, oh, this is one of those, and you can work everything out. So you can use these wherever there's enough information to do that type inferencing. So I mean, I've taken the very short syntax here, but as you start introducing parameters, you need to start adding parentheses. And if you start doing more in the code, then you have to turn this into a block. Sorry, Gary, what?
In the print line, you've got the literal hello. Shouldn't that be the
Yeah, I was just trying to trick you there. Yeah, good catch. That would have got through a unit test, wouldn't it? So that's where you can use a lambda. And it's nothing to be scared of. It's just like an anonymous method. That's how I like to think of it. Just works in the compiler. So there are restrictions around what you can do. Suppose we added a prefix. We've got a variable here, and I want to use that variable as a prefix for my message. Yeah, I kept doing that. That's fine. The rule here is that if you're going to use local variables in your lambda, it has to be final or effectively final. So this isn't, it's not marked final, but it's considered effectively final because no one else is assigning to it. If we try to do that, we get an error on the lambda saying you can't do it, it needs to be effectively final. So what I want you to take from here is it's not just the basics of the specs that are working in Eclipse. They've gone into the corners and are enforcing all these necessary rules. Now, along with lambdas is something called method references. What we have here, this isn't a reusable lambda. The minute the lambda's been attached to a printer, it becomes a printer. I can't then treat it as something else. I can't use printer to satisfy some other interface. P2 is just a printer. When you want to reuse a lambda-like thing, you switch to a method reference. So what on earth is he talking about? Right, let's do something a little different. Let's create just a simple data structure that we're going to reuse. Something they've added in Java 8 is kind of stream support around collections. So you can do more functional style map filter operations. So I can take any collection and just turn it into a stream. Okay, and then I can write filters and map functions that apply to elements of that string, of that stream. So I'm going to say, for every element of this stream, I want to map to an int, and I'm going to map a string to a length of a string. So map to int takes a functional interface, and I'm satisfying that with a lambda. And then I'm going to say for each element that comes downstream, I'm going to print it. And it's an int, so I'm going to just print out the int. This is another case where you can't use content assist on sysout. I have to type it. So that's exploiting the new stream support and including the lambdas. Now, of course, you could do this with anonymous inner classes, but it would be hideous. You would have two anonymous inner classes in the flow here, and it would be unreadable. So that works just fine. But this, there is already something that does this. Goes from a string to a length of a string. It's the method length on string. So I can use a method reference to say, just use that. a colon is method reference. I'm saying use the length method in string to satisfy the functional interface. So that's a reusable thing. So anywhere there's a functional interface that can be satisfied by that, I can just pass in a method reference. And that will do the same thing. And if I want to write my own, then I just need to print. So now I can pass in the one I've written. I'm using my own method reference. And you can do similar things with constructor references. If there's something that needs to build something and you've got a method that knows how to build things that satisfies that functional interface, you can pass it in. So that runs just fine. So a method reference is kind of a reusable lambda. So this is being reused in whatever context. I have something that's an int and I want to do something with it. So that is lambdas. I don't want to dive in any deeper on that. You can read up on them. But the thing to take away from this is if you want to play with them in Java 8 and Eclipse, just do it. They work. Unless if you use beta 106. So. What we're going to look at next, another quick feature. Let's look at something that doesn't work, just to show you it's not all roses. Something you can do now in Java 8 is, you can't do this in Java 7. I can't put two annotations on a class. What you can do in Java 8 is say, hey, this thing's repeatable. And this is the container class. And then I have to define the container class, which is another annotation, but it has a very strict structure that says I'm an array. So this bit, that's all fine, good Java 8 stuff. The fact that you can't do it, that's because it hasn't been implemented yet in the Eclipse Java compiler. All the compiler has to do when it compiles that class is produce a bytecode that contains this. So that's what you'll see. There's no magic there. All it's done is we've marked it repeatable and said what the container is so that the compiler knows where to pack in those annotations. So I'm hoping they've started doing this in Spring, and Spring broke for a while because Jürgen made one of the interfaces repeatable, and then he wrote a test case for it, and the test case wouldn't compile in Eclipse. This would, because it's just a reference to a JRE type called repeatable. But I had to slap his wrist, and we had to change it to which means the same thing, but in Java 7 terms. So that's when I chased the JDT team, and they said they are actively working on that feature. The last thing we'll look at is type annotations. Particularly close to my heart because I implemented these for the Eclipse JDT compiler. We are helping those guys move things along as fast as we can, so this was hanging out, something that needed doing, so I said it would help out. What are type annotations? Basically, there are more places you can annotate in Java 8. So I think you're familiar with this kind of thing, where I can say not null. I can do that kind of thing. But as usual, annotations by themselves do nothing. Unless someone is inspecting them and doing something about them, they just sit there in the class file. And I'll show you something now that some of you may not know about. Oh, this needs to be in a package. Keep things happy. Okay, so the Eclipse compiler has been able to do this for a long time. So if you use this in your build system, where is it? Oops. Null analysis. So I can go down and say, within null analysis for this project, enable annotation-based null analysis. Configure it. The JDT compiler includes some defaults for this, but I'm going to use my class. So this isn't new in Java 8, this has been there for a while. And now, when JDT does compilation, it actually, I told it to know what this means. This means something cannot be null. So now we start getting compiler warnings saying, you can't assign null, it doesn't work. Okay? And now type annotations mean I can start putting annotations in funny places. They will look like funny places, trust me. So I put one here. I need to make this something proper now. Well, we use diamond. Got to insist on that. Oh, we got an error, and that is because to use type annotations, there is a new target type use. Actually, there's two, type parameter and type use, but I'm just going to use type use here. So now I can annotate elements of generics. You can put them in all kinds of crazy places. And we already have support now in the Eclipse compiler for policing that. So we are checking that. So if you want to start exploiting that feature in your build, you could do that. The reason I said it looks a bit weird at times is that this is crazy, but it's correct. So the annotation goes next to the type if you have a fully qualified type, not at the start of the package. So it looks a bit funky. But as I say, by themselves, the annotations do nothing. So you're relying on third-party tools, find bugs, that kind of thing, to start picking up on this. So you'll see a lot more of that, I think, as Java 8 takes off. So that's Java 8, the things that are working at the moment, the things you can play around with. I'll just do one more quick demo here. AspectJ. We recently released AspectJ 180M1. Now normally, the first milestone of a major AspectJ release can't compile code of that language, it can just weave into code. So AspectJ 170M1 could weave 1.7 code, but it couldn't compile it. But because Jürgen and the Spring Framework guys ran off and decided to do Java 8, they needed an AspectJ compiler very early on. So this first version, this milestone, can build 1.8 code. So I have my aspect here. Let's use the example I had before. Let's print something. Let's implement the interface with in the aspect, the main method. It's demo.clara. I think I know how to write AspectJ code. It's just AspectJ, isn't it? Let's put it in implementation. There is a lot of work we can do with AspectJ and Java 8 if we want to go that far. At the moment, we are just doing the basic stuff to keep Spring Framework happy. So this just shows you can mix up your Java 8 constructs with your AspectJ. But also, we can write some advice. In the mix. No, I thought that was right. And you'll see we've got the advice markers advising the default method in the interface. So AspectJ is already able to weave some of this cool stuff you can do in Java 8. Okay, so that's AspectJ 180M1. You get that in the 340M1 release of STS. So that's it for Java 8 related demos today. And they all worked. It's amazing. Yeah.
Should we do?
Yeah,
Yeah?
I think we can do that quickly.
Okay. Because there's one thing left. It's not this kind of Apple-like presentation, but we tried not only to implement more Spring tools, more Java 8 tools, but also make Eclipse itself fun to use and more fun to use for you, make it more modern, tiny little things. And one thing that we did, you already saw, is the quick button for stopping and restarting an application. Something that you think, hey, this is missing in Eclipse. Why is it missing? So we added it there. But there's one feature that I'm especially proud of, because I think it's so amazing. It's so unbelievable amazing. It's motivated by searching in Eclipse. I don't like searching in Eclipse. I don't know exactly why, but pushing up this dialog, you search in your workspace, and it takes years to complete, and shows up in this tree structure. I think that sucks. And I always ask me, other tools can do better. Why cannot Eclipse do better? And we implemented the quick search for Eclipse. And this is really easy. There's just a keystroke, open it up in search dialog, and now you search for something like whatever you type is being searched. So let's search for something, and immediately the results show up from your workspace. It's immediately while you are typing. And you can quickly jump to that. Wrong keyboard.
Yeah, it's the right keyboard.
Yeah, sorry. my return key is bigger. I jump immediately to that piece that you selected. It's incredibly fast. It searches all the files in your workspace immediately without producing extra indexes, consuming extra memory, whatever. It is just as you are typing. And it's so amazingly fast. I use that search only. You can even say, okay, what was a method call? Was called print default, bang, I'm there, right? I don't even use any other search in Eclipse anymore. I just use these quick search as you type. It's so amazing. I'm so happy about that. I had to show you this feature. The good thing is, first, it is installed by default in STS. So if you download the STS distribution, it's installed by default. But if you're using a plain Eclipse installation, you can just install this tiny little feature into an existing Eclipse installation. So you don't have to use STS if you don't want to, or if you prefer Eclipse with other plugins, whatever. You can just install these small, tiny little quick search as you type. The quick search from the Eclipse marketplace, for example.
What version of STS is that in?
The quick search was introduced in 3.3.0, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was in 3.3.0 introduced. And you can, again, install into any Eclipse. I think sorry?
What's the shortcut?
It's Command-Shift-L.
One problem we had with this feature is that we put it in and no one knew it was there. If you didn't look in the new noteware, you wouldn't know it. Yeah. So that's why at the same time we added the tooltips. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It pops up at the bottom. The tooltips let you know about this kind of thing that we've added that you wouldn't be aware of otherwise.
Here we are. Tiny little other thing showing you tooltips. Maybe it's...
Now, some of you might find that as annoying as a paperclip. Let us know.
Therefore,
this us to tell you useful things that you want to know.
Don't show again. You can enable that. And of course, it was mentioned in the new and noteworthy documentation.
Who reads that?
Sorry?
Who reads that?
Yes. Okay. I think that's it. We can switch back to the Q&A, if that's okay with you.
Someone talked about it earlier, but I'll just quickly mention it. Things like the visual builder for Spring integration. We want to think about rewriting those components, not just to improve them, but to make them into HTML5 components. Because we have people who want flow builders inside STS and outside of STS. And we're wondering, can we build just one? And show it in Eclipse, so it looks like it's a piece of Eclipse, only it looks better than Eclipse. And then also, can they use that component, say you've deployed a Spring integration application, just visit it on a different URL, suddenly you get exactly the same view you're familiar with. And we've had, as well as integration, Spring XD has a similar flow builder requirement. So we're saying, can we build these components HTML5. So we're going to start exploring that soon.
Yeah, and we're also trying to find more tiny little things that we can add to Eclipse to make Eclipse more fun to use, like the quick search as type. We continue work on performance, and the release schedule looks like the usual stuff. Here you will get a new STS release shortly after every Eclipse release. So the next version, the milestone one of 3.4.0, stuff that we showed here, will be available this afternoon, and the release of 3.4.0 will be available after the Eclipse Kepler SR1 release, which is end of September, so we will release early October. That's the usual cycle that we follow. That's very predictable. It's all the same all the time. Okay.
Any questions?
More questions?
We're around, so you can come and hassle us and beat us up about things if you want to.
Yeah, I will be in the demo lounge up on the second level of the Hyatt for the next hour. If you want to show up and discuss stuff, show some more stuff, whatever, chat, feel free to come by. We'll be happy to discuss stuff.
And if you don't know where to get these things, there is a tools page on Spring.io now, so you can grab the latest or grab the latest milestone. Thanks
Or
a lot.
send us an email. Thank you again.